fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
And joining us on the phone is the author of Savage Appetites, 4 True Stories of Woman, Crime, and Obsession, Rachel Monroe. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, first of all, Rachel, what led you to write this book?
Well, to be honest, it started with curiosity about my own strange mind, I suppose. I tend to think of myself as a nice, kind, friendly, nonviolent person, and yet there were these periods in my life when all I wanted to consume were stories of just like the worst things that humans did, and that really kind of puzzled me. I wasn't sure what I got out of it and why those stories were so appealing to me. It felt like that there was something wrong with that, but then I also understood that I was by far not the only one, and so it started with that curiosity about myself, and then once I started realizing how the majority of the audience for these crime stories was women, that really struck me as something that was interesting and surprising, and was something I wanted to dig further into.
So what were the differences? Like, did you find that men just didn't have the same fascination, or did you ever research the differences and the percentages?
Well, it's hard to get clear or strict percentages, but it's definitely the case that if you look at the audiences for a lot of the true crime podcasts out there, they're typically, or a lot of them, the ones that I found were maybe at least two-thirds of the listenership is women. There have been studies about true crime books and how that audience is disproportionately female. There are these true crime TV cable networks now that just have only true crime programming, and they have a majority female audience as well, like over 80% female. Even shows like CSI, which are obviously not true, but are in the same kind of space, they definitely draw a more female audience.
How curious, Rachel, because when I do my lectures, I have noticed that the majority in the audience is female. I wonder if this is the same thing.
Yeah, and and which is not to say there aren't men who are interested in these topics. Of course there are. These are things that in some ways just preoccupy us as human beings. And one of my answers to when people ask, why do women love true crime, is like, well, women are people and people love true crime. But it is interesting and notable that it does seem to be disproportionately a female interest.
I just wonder, what about the true crime or the murder fascinates females so much more than men? Is it just they get more personal with the killer and the victims?
I think some ways it can be. I think that can be a big motivation. The trend that you're seeing in true crime more recently, maybe since the 90s, is to be, just like you're saying, very psychological about the perpetrator, about maybe his childhood, his family, his motivations, or about the victims. And I do think that interest in human psychology, and particularly the dark side of human psychology, tends to appeal to women. I think also sometimes you'll hear from women that their interest stems from an experience that they had, a traumatic experience that they had, either personally or maybe somebody that they knew was a victim of a crime, and that really spurred their interest. Because I do think that there are some people, maybe a lot of people, when there's something that's frightening to them, they want to get closer to it, and learn more about it, and that helps them feel safe or in control. So that might be part of it too.
Rachel, you linked it to what you talked about, 4 archetypes. Is that connected to that?
Well, yeah, definitely. The way I structured the book, because just like we're talking about now, I ended up realizing that there are so many different reasons, and some reasons for an interest in these stories might apply to one woman that wouldn't apply at all to another woman. And so just to capture some of the breadth there, I looked at 4 different archetypes of identification, kind of like, when you read a crime story, are you identifying with the detective? Are you thinking about, how am I going to solve this crime? Are you identifying with the victim, which a lot of people do? Are you identifying maybe with the lawyer who's trying to bring justice? Or in some cases, are you identifying with the killer? Which is more troubling, but is certainly something that
like
happens.
a Columbine kind of situation.
Yeah, one of the stories that I write about in the book is about a young woman in Illinois who became, during a period in her life when she was pretty depressed and isolated, living in her parents' house, unemployed, very few friends, she became really fascinated with Columbine, and there are a lot of people online and a lot of young women online who really identify with the Columbine killers and see them as I don't know if heroes is the right word, but see in them something that they find appealing, which is really troubling for sure.
Yes.
So was there a particular reason that you chose these 4 stories? Like, you've probably come across a lot of different stories in your research, but was there something in each one of these that grabbed your attention?
Well, each of these women is a pretty extreme case, right? So if we're talking about interest in crime stories, true crime, that's something that I have, but it certainly hasn't taken over my whole life at all. But I think that it can be really useful to look at some of the more extreme cases, the outliers. I think they can help reveal a pattern, maybe, in some ways, and by looking at the people who are the most extreme, we can kind of see where we fall on that spectrum. Like, okay, well, maybe I'm not going to devote my whole life to getting somebody out of prison who was wrongfully convicted, but there's a little part of that fight for justice that I do identify with. And so these 4 women, they really, I mean, their whole lives in some ways became dedicated to these various crime stories.
Well, your first one, was it Frances Glessner Lee, the nutshell studies that you speak about?
Yeah, exactly.
In 2016, I did a lecture in Baltimore, and a fellow lecturer was Bruce Goldfarb, who is the keeper of those models. Great. So I was curious.
Yeah, he's writing a book about. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just saying that he's writing a book about Frances Glessner Lee, which I think will be really great because he knows more than anybody.
Oh, he was mesmerizing. So that was really an interesting conversation about, I think it was 18 models there, is what I remember.
Yeah, definitely. And they were displayed at the Smithsonian recently, which, to be honest, like gave me a little twinge of envy because it used to be, they had really never been on public display before, and I felt very proprietary towards them. There are these, just to try to explain them, they're very strange. They look like dollhouses. You could call them dollhouses, but the woman who made them, Frances Glessner Lee, did not like people referring to them as dollhouses because to her that made them sound like they were playthings or toys in some way, and they were not. They were educational tools, but they did look like dollhouses, and they're very precise. They're very particularly done. Like there's a little tiny mouse trap in one of them, and it really snaps. You can read the headlines on the tiny little newspapers, but the thing that makes them special is that in each one of these dollhouse rooms, there's a dead body, a dead doll. And her intention was that they would be used to train police officers to investigate crime scenes in a very deliberate, scientific way, rather than she thought there was a problem of bias and kind of instinctual investigations that wasn't rooted in objective science. And so there are all these little clues in these models that if you look at them carefully, you can figure out whether the dead doll was killed by suicide, whether it was an accident, whether it was murder. That you have to be very logical and very observant, and that's what she was trying to train police officers to do.
Well, she was much like the beginning of science. That's impressive to have her do that at such a time.
She's a fascinating woman. She grew up she was born in the 19th century into a family that really didn't believe that women should get educations, particularly, and she wanted to be a nurse, but her family forbade that. And then when she was in middle age and she came into her inheritance, she essentially trained herself in forensics, which, as you're saying, was really new then, and had to kind of self-educate because she hadn't been given the opportunity to go about learning these things in a traditional way. And she became a real expert. But it was always a struggle for her because people didn't take her seriously. They thought it was quirky, that you had this woman who's a grandmother, talking about blood splatter and things like that. But she really was like a real expert, real self-trained expert on that science.
And I think Bruce was talking about maybe that what's that show called, Murder, She Wrote? That
Yes.
That there's a connection there, so that they may have used her or something.
Yeah, and there's also there was a character on a season of CSI who was based on her. I think that it was a killer called the Miniature Killer who would build tiny replicas of the crime scenes and leave them behind as clues, and that's also based on Frances Glessner Lee.
Wow. That to me, I was always intrigued by that when I had read that. So you got to see those at the Smithsonian?
No, I did see them at the Smithsonian, but I first saw them a decade ago at the Maryland Medical Examiner's office.
Oh, okay.
I've been fascinated with them for a long time, and I found an excuse to finagle my way in there into the medical examiner's office to get a look at them.
I just remember the detail. Her obsession must have been just intense, just to be patient enough to do all of that.
She was, I think, a really difficult person to be around in that she had such an incredible mind, and she was so driven, and just like you're saying, you look at these tiny dollhouse rooms and the precision is so obsessive and intense. You kind of get a sense of her personality. But there's also some fun.
Oops, we lost them.
Making them these perfect little puzzles. But she got in a lot of fights with a lot of people, kind of like I was saying before, because she wasn't taken, all she wanted was to be taken seriously, and she was trying to work with these scientists at Harvard, and they really weren't that interested in hearing what she had to say.
Well, I think they still use those ideas or those models even today, so that she quite the influential person.
Yeah, it's really incredible. And one of the cool things about the Nutshell studies is, like I said, they are all little tiny murder mysteries. And in most cases, the answers, the solution to the whodunit is not public knowledge. And so even when they were on display at the Smithsonian, the answer wasn't right there. So it was really fun to just eavesdrop on people trying to puzzle it out. And with so many of these crime stories, we're used to having closure, right? To like knowing it all wraps up in a neat little bow at the end. And you don't get those with her models, which I think is pretty cool. And that's because they do still want to use them as training tools. And if the answers were out there on the internet, that wouldn't work anymore.
Oh, true.
There's always an answer on the internet. Come on.
I heard from one of the other folks who works at the Maryland Medical Examiner's office a funny story where so they use these little dollhouses to train police officers still every year in these investigative techniques, and the answers are all in a locked file cabinet in the administrator's office. And one day he came back to work late one night and found that the police officers in the training were trying to break into his file cabinet to steal the answers, to like steal a peek, because they felt so frustrated that they couldn't solve the crime. They just couldn't stand it, so they were trying to cheat. But
well, that explains why
put a big padlock.
That explains why Bruce Goldfarb, when he was doing his lecture, he was very cryptic about those answers. So now I get it.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Yep. Yeah, if you want them to still be useful, you've got to keep the mystery alive.
Is that sort of a big, how do you say it? Is that what draws people in? Is that the unsolved part of it? That everyone tries to be that armchair detective?
I think for some people that's a real motivation. I think that in writing that chapter on the detective, that seemed to me to be the appeal of that archetype is, the detective is the one who figures everything out. They get to kind of remain slightly separate from the crime. They have this allure of omniscience, right, and being the one who knows and who solves things. And I think that can be really attractive. And you see that a lot in the contemporary equivalent, I guess, is these online amateur detectives. And that's there are a lot of them on the internet, and a lot of them are women.
and you're talking to one right now. I'm one of these people.
You're one of the women online.
Yes, that's true. That's true. But I'm telling you, I'm obsessed with doing the detective and searching like that.
Yeah, cold cases and stuff like that.
Oh, I focus on the Whitechapel murders, Jack the Ripper, and Specific Suspect.
Oh.
And that's what my books are.
Oh
on.
man.
So.
So who did it?
Oh, of course I know that. No. In research, how I do it is that if you ever say 100% case closed, then you are done, and you're not a true researcher. You just want to fill a belief, and I hate that. My background is science, and so it's all about the data. So,
Totally.
But if I was a betting man, I would say the guy that I researched, Francis Humbley, he's a pretty character, but he. So that I think that's what intrigued me, and even though that you were definitely focused on these women, I just remember doing that as well. So, and then you also did.
Yeah, well, I think.
What's that?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think you're totally right that there is among some people a real desire to have a definitive answer, and that's so troubling, because in a lot of these cases we won't ever know. We can't ever know, for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's not like movies then, TV then.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And then also, I was curious about. I was reading a little bit that you were talking about the guest house of Sharon Tate as well. And
Yes. So 50 years ago this month is when Sharon Tate and a number of other people were murdered by the Manson family. And I tend to be interested in more of the aftermath of a crime than the actual crime itself, and that's certainly a story that looms large in the cultural imagination. And that house, too, the house where the Manson family killed Sharon Tate and those other people, became kind of a dark tourist attraction in its own way. And I write about that house and some of the people who passed through that house, including a young woman who rented it in the 1990s and moved into the place where Sharon Tate was murdered, and then became really fascinated with that case. And it, in some ways, maybe it took over her life too.
Do you think that, in a way, people watch or get into true crime because it kind of, there's something they relate to and they're kind of facing their own fears, maybe?
I think in a lot of cases that's certainly true, and in the section that I write about the victim, when people talk about empathy and identification, I think that can be a big motivation. Is maybe something has happened in their own life, and maybe it wasn't as terrible as being murdered, probably, but some other kind of trauma or violence, and then reading about things that happen to other people helps them work through what happened to them.
What
Were you? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, what do you hope people get out of your book? Like when they pick up the book and they read it, what is it you're trying to get across to them?
Honestly, I think it's a lot about what we were just talking about, and the lack of closure and the resistance to maybe easy answers or formulaic answers. I think that the more that you learn, in some ways, the more you realize how much you don't know. And I hope that this book maybe calls people to question when they feel like they have a sense of certainty about, this definitely happened. I guess I just want people to question that a little bit more, and then also to think in more complicated and nuanced ways about, what does it mean when we're taking real violence that happened to real people and turning it into entertainment. I'm not saying that that's bad, but I think it's something that we just need to think about in a complex and thorough way.
Are you thinking that might lead to some sort of trouble as well? People like enjoying it, like getting into entertaining and having conventions and meetings and talking about your favorite murder,
Right, exactly. No, I think that it can be, the danger is that the fact that these are real people and real terrible things that happen to real people can get lost. I mean, there's so many things on the internet happen like that, right? It's easy to forget that there's a real person on the other side of the screen, and there's been some great writing there's a piece in the Washington Post recently about a man whose sister was murdered, and how strange it is for him to read about his sister online, and all these people kind of speculating about her personal life and treating her murder as if it was an interesting puzzle or an intellectual exercise, and not maybe fully realizing that there was a real person with family members out there. But then at the same time, he's also really grateful that people are paying attention to her story at all. So I think it cuts both ways. But yeah, I think murder as strict entertainment, that gets you into some shaky ethical territories for sure.
It's interesting is like these copycats. You could see them getting obsessed with this particular, offender or something, and then the next thing you know, we have a copycat killer, kind of like the Columbine situation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you see that over and over. There have been, I think, over 30, maybe even more at this point, mass shooters who have identified Columbine as their model, as their heroes, as their inspiration. And so I think that was something I thought about a lot in writing that chapter on people who identify with killers, is what responsibility do we have as a culture? How do we make sure that we're getting information out there, but we're not accidentally glamorizing or glorifying people who do these terrible acts?
What's interesting about
helping contribute to that mythology.
Well, it's interesting about your archetypes. There's this emotional connection. Yet with the detective, how I always look at it is trying to disengage from any kind of emotion, to try to avoid bias whatsoever. To try to do that, I could see where there's a conflict, just like that brother of the woman that the sister that was killed. You could see that happening.
Totally. But I also think that it's dangerous for us to think that we can be completely bias-free.
Yes.
We're always trapped inside our own head, and so it's so important to have the humility to remember that that's a good goal to strive for. But
Yes.
it's always going to be that. It's a goal maybe more than a reality.
Right.
Do you ever come across any stories that kind of really scared you? As in from the person telling it?
Yeah, it's funny. I had always prided myself, I don't know how you guys are, but I had always prided myself on being able to kind of remain separate, remain objective, and to realize, statistically speaking, murder, especially I'm, like a white woman, that I'm not really statistically at risk to be murdered, particularly by a stranger. Like that's, I should just worry about being struck by lightning if that's what I'm scared of. But at the same time, writing that story about the young woman, Lindsay Savannah, who was assassinated by Columbine and planned a mass shooting, to do that I had to read like thousands of pages of her writings and her chat transcripts, her conversations with the boy that she planned this massacre with. And there was something about that really did get in my head. I had kind of thought that I was immune, but there was just something about all that hate directed at just random strangers and the way they fantasized about this thing that they wanted to do, that really I could feel myself being out in public and feeling paranoid. And usually I love talking to strangers, but I felt myself getting kind of closed off and nervous and shutting down because
now were you feeling
you don't really know what's in anybody's head.
So your thought was that you are starting to identify with this person, and then you started looking at people the same way. It was the other way around, that you could be someone else's victim.
I could be somebody else's victim, you're right, but it also did make me, in some ways, my actions, even if I was afraid of somebody committing violence against me, the outcome was that I was behaving like her. I was becoming more isolated, becoming more kind of closed in with myself, becoming more paranoid. And I think that those ideologies of violence, they do that. They isolate people, make them feel really alone and scared and disconnected. And that was the one that really got in my head for a while.
So what are who do you draw from? What's your big influences?
That's a great question. There are a lot of writers who write about crime in really interesting ways that I find fascinating. Janet Malcolm is a writer who wrote a book called The Journalist and the Murderer, which I really love. There's a journalist down here in Texas named Pamela Koloff, who writes a lot about wrongful convictions and forensic science and the justice system. She's a real inspiration to me. There's a woman in Tennessee who wrote a book called Dead Girls last year, and it's all about how about pop culture mystery stories, and how often they have at their heart or at their center, a dead girl. So those are all writers who I think are approaching the subject in different and interesting ways that I find really inspiring.
Now, do you have a website or a place that people can go if they want to find out more about you?
Yeah, definitely. My website is Rachel, RACHEL Monroe, MONROE.com. I'm also on Twitter. I'm probably on Twitter too much.
Yeah, there's always
find plenty there.
Yeah, it's a bad thing. Well, fantastic. Now, I guess your book is sold everywhere, and it's online. We will have it on our webpage as well, so people listening can just go one click and pick up the book. Again, our guest today has been Rachel Monroe, and the book is Savage Appetites, 4 True Stories of Woman, Crime, and Obsession. Thank you for being here, Rachel.
It was such a pleasure to talk to you guys.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or show, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production
production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.